briefly the work we've been doing with the Cumbria Zero Carbon Cumbria Partnership and the Lake District over the past several years, and what implications that might have on carbon offsetting within the landscape. We have a bit of a history working with Cumbria and the lakes going back to more than 10 years now. And over the years, as you can see, we've piloted this methodology of what we call a consumption-based carbon accounting for the landscape. And eventually this resulted in a Cumbria-wide assessment just about 3 years ago, which helped then secure funding for the Zero Carbon Cumbria Partnership, and that in turn has led to us extending this program to the entire set of UK's national parks, several areas of outstanding national beauty, and we have just been updating our Cumbria assessment in recent months. Now, there are major challenges and opportunities for landscapes in the face of the climate and ecological crisis. We want to make sure we cut emissions in line with the cutting-edge research and data. We want to be land stewards and planning authority leaders, create better places to live, work, and visit. But importantly, last but not least, we've got to adopt and scale up land-based measures to help with climate mitigation, climate adaptation, and broader nature recovery. And what we look at specifically here is woodland creation, peatland restoration, and renewable energy production uptake, as well as regenerative agriculture. So these are the kind of components that we focus on in our assessments. And I've got to talk you through briefly the broader framework of our analysis for Cumbria. I think it's very important just to provide a background and sort of, to help you understand some of the kind of pathways towards net zero that I'm going to present in a few minutes' time. So first of all, we take a consumption-based approach. I've already mentioned it tracks the full footprint of lifestyles, of goods and services that are consumed within the landscape. We look at various actors you can see on the right-hand side, the residents, the visitors, both in the landscape and traveling to and from the area. That's really relevant for Cumbria, of course, with the Lake District being a major attraction from elsewhere in the UK and abroad. We also look at land management and land use, and that's where, of course, the bulk of the conversation about offsetting takes place, and the broader industry as well. Of course, part of that is agriculture and forestry. So there are overlaps, obviously, everywhere between all those sort of components of emissions. Why consumption-based approach? Because in our opinion, this is what leaders need to adopt to accelerate low carbon transition. We unfortunately are lagging behind, in the UK and globally in our climate efforts and nature recovery efforts as well. And we want to sort of supercharge the action by tracking the kind of true footprints of the lifestyles. And it means that a lot of the emissions that we report originate elsewhere in the landscape, but obviously a lot of them are still within the landscape, and they are resembling the official government reporting, which we refer to as production-based footprints. So there are various overlaps there. And I've already mentioned the key sources of the emissions that we track in relation to Cumbria, or the lakes within the Cumbria. And because of the overlaps and the complexities, we narrow this footprint down into what we call a baseline. So we select a subset of key priority areas or emission categories, for which we then subsequently set targets to decarbonize or sequester carbon and achieve net zero and negative emissions in the longer run. Of course, there are considerable uncertainties. The industry footprint is notoriously difficult to estimate, but overall, we've got land-based emissions as well are quite uncertain still. But the data is improving, the science is improving, and we're getting there. I think we've got a good product for practical decision making. And we're still working with a 2019 base year in the assessment, so we have to be mindful of the kind of effects of the pandemic and the rebound after that. So still in the 2019 baseline. So with that caveat, this is the kind of the baseline footprint for Cumbria that we we have been working with. It consists of 5 broad categories. You can see everything to do with energy consumption. That's mostly within the landscape. So residents, visitors, industries, gas, petrol, everything, electricity used there. That's the biggest part of the emissions. Food and drink, and a lot of that is produced elsewhere, not in Cumbria, because of the supply chains. A lot of that is imported as well. Very high emissions usually. Any other goods and services that are consumed by the residents and the visitors traveling to and from. So it's the footprint that is largely outside of Cumbria, but it's sort of related to its pool, particular Lake District's pool of the visitors. And we track the land-based sector, but everything excluding agriculture. So it's the sector that is to do with broader land use change, forestry, but excluding livestock emission and fertilizer use, which is covered separately by the Cumbria Zero Carbon Cumbria Partnership working groups. Now, we want to use that baseline to subsequently set the targets for reducing those emissions and driving our carbon sequestration. And here we use the latest assessments, such as the 6 carbon budgets, the Tyndall carbon budget tool, the National Food Strategy, and we ratchet things up in certain areas where we think they are not ambitious enough. And we understand the challenges, but obviously we want to make sure as well that we kind of stay within the broader Paris Agreement target of 1.5 degree warming relative to pre-industrial conditions. So this is what we take forward, and we assume that the action is taken immediately, across all the key areas that we have identified. And I have to focus specifically on the land use change and management options here. So there are targets that are derived for each landscape. So it could be separately for the Lake District or the Cumbria or the unitary authorities within, based on the current distribution of the habitats and peats. And what we use here is called high-level opportunity mapping for land use change, which is based on the following options: putting new permanent woodlands or commercial forestry, restoring peatlands, uptake of agroforestry, more hedgerows, better grasslands management, and cover cropping, obviously where that's applicable. So these are the key measures for land use and land management that we propose, and we set targets for these measures in line with our overall net zero pathway. And once we've done all that, this is what we've got. So this is the starting point that you've seen just a couple of slides ago, those 5 key priority areas. And all those emission sources, they decarbonize. And at the bottom, you can see the carbon uptake by the land-based measures that I've just outlined. Idealized pathway here, so you can argue about how quickly woodland, for example, is going to uptake the carbon, but this is sort of again sufficient for a modeling tool like that. So it's 2037 pathway for Cumbria, and a relatively large sort of carbon offsetting insetting in the landscape towards the end of the horizon period, the 2050 period. And if you just break down sort of the states at the start of this pathway, so in 2019 and towards the end of the pathway, this is the kind of pie chart that shows how much reduction in emissions or uptake in carbon sequestration we get, overall. And you can see the nature-based solutions, they account for about a fifth of the overall efforts. Of course, the energy, food supply from elsewhere, travel are very important to decarbonize, but local measures to sequester carbon are quite considerable as well. And my final slide here looks a bit more at the underpinning targets across these priority land-based measures that I've outlined. These are the hectareages on the left-hand side. And the color coding just shows the relative magnitude of those values per year uptake across Cumbria for each of those measures: woodlands, agroforestry, grassland management, and finally peatland restoration. And on the right-hand side column, you can see the associated uptake of carbon, or the increase in carbon sequestration. And you can see that, those are very large numbers. Some of them are directly derived from the 6 cabinet budgets apportioned to Cumbria. For woodland target, we use a more ambitious targets. It's 2,000 hectares per year altogether for the entire landscape. And if you look at the overall intensity of measures, 12,000 or something hectares per year, over a 30-year period, that would be half of the landscape covered in Cumbria. But look at the carbon sequestration fluxes. Woodland creation is the biggest effect. Peatland restoration is important, but that's more cutting the emissions that are occurring right now. So it's less sequestration, more reducing the emissions. And agricultural management is important. A lot of hectareage here in grassland and cover cropping, but the effect is limited. It's important, but it's not as big as for the woodland or the peatland option. So I'm going to end on this note that we've got a lot of potential to adopt various land management practices and sequester carbon alongside reducing the emissions in all the other areas. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Dimitri, and thanks for pretty much keeping to time with a lot of information to impart. So people do remember to use the chat and the Q&A function to raise points and to ask questions. Thank you. We're going to have to move on swiftly to Tim, who's an environmental consultant and founder of Green Small Business based in Cumbria, who's going to talk about responsible carbon management and the role of offsetting.
Thank you, Karen. I'm going to talk about the use of carbon offsetting as a mechanism by individuals and businesses. I think I'm a bit of a devil's advocate in this session, perhaps. Anyway, let's see where we go. I'll briefly introduce myself, just talk a little bit about the terminology, and then I have a lot of my own views about carbon offsetting. I may slip one or two of my own views in as we go through, but I'm mainly going to focus on a report that was published towards the back end of last year by the Climate Change Committee, which looked at voluntary carbon markets and carbon offsetting, and just feedback some of the key messages that came from that report, and I'll draw some conclusions at the end. And I should say I'm full of cold and keep breaking into coughing fits, so do excuse me if that happens. I'll do my best. This is me. I run Green Small Business. That's the front page of my website. We work with businesses on environmental and carbon management through those various aspects: environmental certification and carbon footprinting, and training and consultancy, and looking at buildings as well. No carbon offsetting, and that may well become clear, the reasons behind that. So what is carbon offsetting, or carbon compensation, perhaps? It's about investing in projects that reduce carbon to offset the emissions that you are producing as an individual, as a business, as a product, as a service. You can offset emissions from anything, and tree planting would be the most common type of offset. There are lots of different types, but tree planting is the most common. If you remember your GCSE biology, you'll remember that trees draw carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and they emit oxygen as part of their growth through photosynthesis. So tree planting is the most common type of offsets, and there are two categories of offsets. One is carbon removal. Tree planting would be an example of that. So actually removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So that the nature-based examples would be tree planting, restoring peat bogs, etc., etc. But there are technological approaches as well, really important emerging technologies. You can Google these afterwards: direct air capture, BECCS, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, biochar, another one. So they're the carbon removal offsets, and then there are carbon avoidance offsets as well. And that's about preventing carbon emissions that would, in theory, have been released were it not for your project. So you might purchase a bit of a forest or contribute to the purchase of a bit of a forest in order to protect it from deforestation. You might invest in renewable energy installations to displace the burning of fossil fuels in the generation of energy. Or another common one is investing in efficient cooking stoves in developing countries. So they're the kind of carbon avoidance, like displacing carbon production. So those two types, carbon removal and carbon avoidance, and you can use those offsets to counter, to balance out the emissions that you are responsible for. And if you get to a balance, you can talk about being carbon neutral. You know, you've balanced out your produced emissions with offsets. You've reached that balance point. And we can also talk about net zero. And there's a subtle difference between carbon neutral and net zero. The end game is the same, if you like. You know, it's about getting to that balance point where there's no net emissions of carbon. But there's a couple of key distinctions. With net zero, there's a much more heavy focus on carbon emissions reduction. So in this corporate net zero standard on the right of the screen there, that's it's kind of broadly accepted now as a standard for businesses in terms of net zero. That sets a requirement for a 95% reduction in emissions before you can use offsets to fill the gap. So you're really only offsetting the unavoidable emissions, the emissions you can't get rid of. So very, very different approach to carbon. You could achieve carbon neutral today, tomorrow, by buying enough offsets. You can't achieve net zero very quickly because you've got to reduce all of the avoidable emissions first. And the other key difference is you can't use those avoidance type of offsets. You have to use the carbon removal type of offsets to achieve the official kind of net zero standard. So that's offsetting and net zero. And offsetting is a big deal now. And as a result, the Climate Change Committee did an investigation into carbon markets, voluntary carbon markets and offsetting back end of last year. For those that don't know, the Climate Change Committee is an independent statutory body established back in 2008, advising the UK and the devolved governments on their progress in addressing climate change. And their website is full of all sorts of useful reports, including this one, where they look at the risks and opportunities presented by voluntary carbon markets and carbon offsetting. And there are three key messages in that report, which I'll come on to, jumping ahead a little bit there. So, but the first thing that really struck me in this report is the scale of this industry. You know, carbon offsetting is a huge industry, $2 billion plus industry, and growing at an exponential rate, as you can see on the chart there. And most of that growth is in the support for these land-based measures, particularly avoiding deforestation and reforestation, planting trees. So it's a huge industry, and they investigated it and came up with three key messages. So message number one: high integrity carbon credits purchased by businesses can play a small but important role in supporting the transition to net zero. So they talk about a small but important role. So the reason for their concern, their caution, was the question marks that exist around some of these offsetting projects. How permanent are they? You know, how permanent are those trees that are planted? The performance of them, who's measuring, who's watching, who's tracking that performance? If you're a Guardian reader like me, you'll have seen investigations published recently about the performance of certain big offsetting schemes, and question marks as well about the potential negative impacts of some of the carbon offsetting schemes. So things like displacing the production of food, raising land prices, displacing native communities, and so on. But nevertheless, a small role in supporting the transition to net zero. Message number 2, stronger regulation, guidance, and standards are needed to ensure that carbon offsetting is not used as a substitute for direct business emissions reduction. So they go on to say the evidence reviewed for this report suggests that VCF, voluntary carbon markets, are not currently supporting net zero. So they might play a small but important role in future. Climate Change Committee says currently they're not supporting the transition to net zero. And that's because low prices, you can buy carbon offsets ridiculously cheap. And the inaccurate claims that are being made mean that credits may not be meaningfully reducing emissions, while their use may cause buyers to take less action on their own emissions impact. That sense of, we buy these offsets so that we can just carry on business as usual. I come across that in my work with businesses. I think that's a real cause for concern.
You're at 10 minutes, Tim, if you could start wrapping up.
Okay.
Thanks.
I'll be very quick. And
Great.
Message number 3 kind of reinforces the previous point, really. There's a real risk that voluntary carbon markets could slow progress towards net zero or damage other priorities, such as climate adaptation and biodiversity. So what do we need? Well, we need less net and more zero, in my opinion. I'm gonna coin that as a hashtag, I think, less net, more zero. We can't offset our way out of the climate emergency. We have to focus on emissions reduction. And to do otherwise, I think as a business, particularly, I come at this from a business perspective, you put yourself at significant corporate risk now because of this increasing scrutiny of carbon offsetting, increasing talk of greenwashing. I'll make one final point, and that is just about the concept of offsetting per se. I think it's got an inherent flaw to it. When we burn fossil fuels, we release geological carbon from what is essentially a permanent carbon store. But when we capture carbon biologically in natural habitats and ecosystems by tree planting and so on, it's very different because that carbon is retained for a much shorter duration. In addition, whilst tree planting might take 15 or 20 years to capture the carbon that we want it to, we're using it to compensate for carbon that we've already emitted. So offsetting projects might offer some sort of compensation for our burning of fossil fuels, and compensation might be a more appropriate term, but giving them a sense of direct equivalence through the use of the term offsetting, I think is unhelpful. And I think it will come under increased scrutiny in the years ahead. So don't get me wrong, we absolutely need to invest in these carbon extraction projects, these carbon sequestration projects, as Dimitri referred to. but perhaps not. Let's not think of it as offsetting. Let's not give it that equivalence with our emissions. Thank you.
Tim.
Sorry for overrunning.
Some really thought-provoking stuff there. Thank you very much. So we're going to move on now to hear from John Buckley, who's Managing Director of Carbon Footprint Limited. And he's going to be talking to us about these verified international offsetting programs.
Excellent.
Over to you, John.
Thank you very much. So I'm just getting my screen ready. I'll share my screen. So try and get the right one. And share. Here we go. Has that worked? Can you see my first page?
That's great.
Of
yeah.
One of my good friends in Kenya, Mburu, planting a tree.
And people do put your questions in the Q&A in the chat. Thank you.
Cool. All right, let's jump straight into it. So for people who don't know who we are, I'm John Buckley. I run a company called Carbon Footprint Limited, and we've been doing this for about 16 years now, helping basically to help businesses understand what their carbon emissions are, what their carbon footprint is, and also helping them to reduce their carbon emissions. And we do, all sorts of things like energy audits and energy surveys and transport audits, help companies look through their supply chain and wider scope 3 emissions for people who are into that sort of thing, and help them set targets as well. And we help a number of we help quite a few companies set science-based targets and go through the science-based initiative net zero sort of process. We work with literally over 1,000 companies each year. Some are massive international organizations, such as the ones that you can see on this slide here. Others kind of small SMEs. So we'll work with anybody who comes and knocks on our door and wants some help. Funnily enough, one of the organisations that does actually offset through us is the Climate Change Committee. It used to be called the Committee on Climate Change. So it's interesting to hear Tim's insight into the report that they said about carbon offsetting, because they actually do it themselves, and one of the organisations that do it through us. Tim's provided a superb overview of the role that carbon offsetting makes. I thought I'd put this slide up early on. You probably all recognise Mark Carney from this, who used to be the governor of the Bank of England, is now the UN's Special Envoy on Climate Change and Finance. And he kind of sees the potential for carbon offsetting as a role in climate change. I'll jump straight to the last sort of highlighted sentence. It isn't the silver bullet, so Tim is completely correct in this. It isn't the silver bullet to climate change, but it is a way of taking some responsibility for the emissions that you've already produced. And I'll let you read this yourself, because there's lots of good stuff, but it's basically saying that, it plays a role in helping companies and the world meet the requirements that they need to get to be net zero. So carbon offsetting, just to repeat a little bit of what Tim's already said, it is a way of financing projects anywhere around the world that either remove or reduce carbon emissions. And Tim sort of did a superb overview of that, so I won't go into that again, which is great. But it is important. It's about climate change is a global issue. So although you might be producing carbon emissions in Cumbria, if you do something to balance out those effects, you can do it either in Cumbria, which is good, or in Cambodia, or in Colombia, or anywhere else beginning with a C as well. And it'll have the same effect on the overall climate. So that's an interesting and key point. There are literally thousands of projects that you can support around the world, ranging from things like investing in supporting renewable energy projects, supporting projects that help to stop deforestation, also projects to do afforestation and other forestry projects. We also support lots of projects that have lots of social and community benefits as well, such as clean drinking water projects in various parts of the world. I mentioned Uganda and Rwanda here, but we have them in other regions as well, and also the cook stove projects, which is all about trying to make cooking much more efficient and reduce pollutants in homes in places where they're using old-fashioned kind of open fires. If you go to our website, I know you're not going to get the slides, but you'll get a recording of this presentation. But if you go to carbonfootprint.com, our website, and then you look at the projects, you can see on our website the range of different types of projects. We've probably got about 50 projects listed on our website that you can support straight away, and that keep an eye on it, because it does change almost on a daily basis as we buy in new projects. So if you're going to buy a carbon offset and support a carbon reduction project or a carbon removal project somewhere in the world, there are some tests as to what makes a good carbon reduction, carbon offset project. So firstly, it needs to be additional. So if you're going to fund a carbon project, you want to make sure that that project only happens when it receives some additional funding from the carbon finance. If it was going to happen anyway, and the carbon finance hasn't really made any difference, then the carbon offsetting hasn't worked, because those savings would have been made anyway. The savings need to be measurable, so we need to be able to go in and work out how much carbon has been saved. It needs to be verifiable and auditable. I'll come on and talk much more about that in a second. It needs to be permanent, so the carbon emissions that we're putting into the atmosphere could be there for hundreds to 1,000 years. So whatever we do to balance out that effect, it needs to have the same inverse effect to putting the carbon emissions into the atmosphere. So whether it's capturing and storing, whether it's in trees or underground, or whether it's reducing carbon emissions, that reduction has to be permanent. We need to make sure it avoids leakage, and what that means is basically by doing a project, it isn't simply transferring emissions to somewhere else. If you imagine stopping protecting a forest from being deforested from illegal loggers, you've also got to make sure, as well as your foresty bit that you're looking after isn't being deforested, you've also got to make sure those illegal loggers don't just move down the road and start logging in another forest, because that's just moving, and that would be leakage. And then the final thing is to avoid double counting. So if your company is buying into a project and buying some carbon offset credits from a project to balance out your carbon emissions, you want to make sure that they are actually yours and they've been allocated to you, and they can't be allocated to anybody else, and somebody else is also claiming that same benefit for their business. So they're the basic checks. Fortunately for us, there are standards that have been set up over the years that do these checks for us. So there's the main ones are Verified Carbon Standard, Gold Standard, and the UN has a program called the Clean Development Mechanisms, CDM, that produces certified emission reductions. And the little picture I've got on the left of this chart, the little circular picture, it actually comes from the Verified Carbon Standard, but actually the process is pretty much the same for the Gold Standard, the UN CDM process, and several other carbon offsetting certification schemes as well. So at the core of the standard is the VCS standard. It's a standard that's been put together through consultation, through peer review process, using NGOs, academia, industry, and often government bodies as well to help produce that standard. There's accounting methodologies that once again have been through that sort of academia and process and peer review process. And that sort of forms the core of what's needed in terms of these standards. And then there's the independent auditing on the left-hand side, where an auditor, independent of the standard and also independent of the carbon offset project developer, will go in and make sure that the project is meeting the standards requirements, and also it checks the amount of carbon credits that it's claiming. And then once we've got that, and it's been through all that process, and it's been through the Verified Carbon Standard final review process as well, it can issue carbon credits onto a registry system. And the registry system is really important because it allows you to track where those carbon emissions are and who owns them effectively. I'll come on a bit more onto that in a second, but also on the registry system, and this is just a screenshot here from Vera's, who run the VCS program. of their documentation system. So with every project that gets produced, they'll have initially a project description document that goes into the description of what the project is and how it meets the standards requirements. It has validation documents, it has verification documents, it has monitoring reports, etc., etc. And you can get all that by sort of logging on to the Vera website and doing a search for the project that you're interested in investing in. Also on this, if you look into the detail on the right, it shows you who the project validator is and the auditor is. So for this particular project, which I can't remember quite which one this is, it looks to be a forestry avoided deforestation project. The project validator on this one is DNV, which is one of the largest auditing organizations in the world. So, you know, we're not using kind of small tin pot auditors. These are, you know, the big auditors that audit lots of other things, not just carbon. This is a screenshot from the Gold Standards Registry, just to balance it out a bit, so I'm not just promoting VCS and Vera. So this screenshot shows a retirement that's been done on behalf of one of our customers. It shows who the customer name is. It shows the amount of credits that have been retired. It shows a date when the credits were produced and carbon savings were made, and it shows a retirement date. And more importantly, or as importantly, it also shows the specific serial number of those carbon credits that have been allocated to this organization, and also the project that it's come from. So this one's from a fuel efficient stoves project in North Darfur, for instance. So all this is sort of documented in, it's all public access as well, so you can log into the Gold Standard Registry or the VCS Registry to see their version of it and see all the retirements that have gone through and find retirements for your company. So it gives that nice auditability trace. I'm at 10.
10 minutes, yeah, John. Thanks.
So that's all good. So we can see the project, international projects are great. They get verified. There's also the quality assurance standard. This was originally set up by the UK government. We as Carbon Footprint Limited were one of the first companies to be signed up to it. It's now run independently from the UK government, just to be clear about that. It's run by a not-for-profit organisation, but basically this has a checklist on the carbon offsetting body like ourselves and make sure that we're following the right rules, using the right sort of projects that are only high quality, and also it checks to make sure that it cross-checks against what we've sold in terms of carbon credits on through our accounts, matches what we've retired on carbon registries. You can find out more about that on the website. And this is my final slide. Really, it's really to point people at the Oxford Principles for Net Zero Line Carbon Offsetting, which is actually quite a good document, which has it's really short, so it's worth googling and finding it. It's only a few pages, but it has 4 principles, and it actually has a bit more reality in it than the science-based target approach, because it recognizes that, you know, if we all wanted to go net zero today, actually following the science-based target approach would never work, because there isn't enough projects that do carbon removals anywhere near enough what we can hope to achieve. So it recommends a gradual approach from carbon reduction type offsetting to carbon removal, so that by the time we get to the mid-century, 2050, we're doing 100% carbon removal for any remaining carbon emissions. And that's it really. But you know, broadly, I'm in line with Tim that, you know, we need to be reducing as much as possible, and, you know, follow the science-based target approach and try and reduce by 90-95% by as soon as possible, and use removal for the remainder, but offset whilst you're on the way.
Less net, more zero. Thank you. Thank you, John. So got our final speaker now coming up, Caroline Turner, who's Development Manager at Cumbria Action for Sustainability, and she's going to be talking about local opportunities for offsetting.
Thanks, Karen. And it was really good to see projects from around the world that work in communities there, John, so that was good. So I am the Development Manager at CAFS, and like I said, we're going to look at how you can offset your emissions if you want to have some local impact. We're all about net zero in Cumbria, so it's in our interest to get as many projects going within the area. So a bit about CAFS. We are the leading climate change and sustainability charity. We're based in Penrith. We've been around for over 25 years, and we're now around 30 part-time staff. We lever in significant funding for climate projects in the county every year. And we run a wide variety of projects and services. You're right to move the slides on. And we've got 5 key areas of work, include our education and training, supporting community-led action, climate projects, reducing energy use, developing low carbon, learning on low carbon food production, and also the Zero Carbon Cumbria Partnership, which I hope you're familiar with. Next slide, please. At the moment, we are sort of looking a bit closer at carbon offsetting, and I use that term quite generally, I'm afraid, because my language needs to improve on this area. We want to look around how do we link businesses, communities and individuals to local community-led carbon saving and conservation projects here in Cumbria. So we're just keen initially to do some scoping. We're looking into the aspirations of Cumbrian businesses with respect to offsetting and the potential for income from local businesses to be used in projects within the communities, such as solar for schools or retrofitting homes, perhaps. We're also looking as to whether those projects need to be verifiable for businesses to want to invest, and are there any benefits in some sort of Cumbria-wide approach. And we know there's discussions already around an ecosystems warehousing approach, and we're keen to just look at the appetites of bringing sort of carbon payments or carbon contributions to non-nature-based project approaches. And of course, we also want to consider, whether offsetting is a distraction and we should sort of just prioritise emissions reduction as an organisation. Next slide. So firstly, we've been looking around at local companies to see what people are doing, and it's a real mix. Some are offsetting through verifiable schemes and are able to claim that they're net zero. Many are doing some sort of tree planting, often involving their staff or working with local communities. Others are donating to projects, so not technically buying carbon credits. And of course, CAFS is one of those organisations that's happy to develop those kind of corporate partnerships. Next slide. So if you are looking to look for carbon credits that are available in Cumbria, as John said, there are voluntary schemes that are all verified, and you can secure credits through those. In the UK, we have the UK Woodland Carbon Code, and you can source credits through that through organisations such as the Cumbria Wildlife Trust, Woodland Trust. There's also national charities, Trees for Life, Soil Association, and of course private organisations who develop and deliver projects and brokers. The UK Woodland Code is internationally recognised, and it's endorsed for its high standards of sustainable forest management and carbon management, and there are a couple of projects in Cumbria that meet this code. The peatland code is similar type of standard. It's for peatland projects, obviously, there's a few projects under development in Cumbria, and some of those are even complete, including Bulkshaw Moss is one by Natural England. And then sort of a newer standard that's appearing is Wilder Carbon. This is a mechanism to invest in nature conservation projects in the UK. They call it Carbon Plus because of the additional biodiversity aspect. So biodiversity is as much as a priority as carbon reduction and removals, and all the projects need to align with the Wilder Carbon biodiversity principles. The standards and the habitat calculator for this standard have been developed in conjunction with a number of the wildlife trusts, and projects are being developed across the UK, including some blue carbon projects in marine habitats. And with the slack mosses in South Lakeland, there's a Cumbrian example registered with them. Moving on. Other interesting developments that could be appropriate here include retrofit credits, potentially. Obviously, Cumbria, we've got reducing our carbon emissions from buildings is critical to get us to net zero, and how to pay for it is a big challenge. And this is a potential aspect of that. So the Housing Association Charitable Trust Act and their project partner Arctica have developed a methodology which measures the carbon savings and the social value created through the home retrofit projects. It's only one of 3 projects in the UK accredited through the VCS standard that John mentioned. The other one's for a food supplement to reduce methane from dairy cattle for interest. And there's another one about methane capture at an abandoned coal mine. But either way, this is currently the only, they claim it's currently the only project that verifies carbon emission reduction in the built environment anywhere in the world. So it really is brand new. Next slide. With that, the retrofit credits, with HACT, it's social housing providers are their main area of emissions reduction. They enroll their appropriate stock. The retrofit team then calculates the emission reductions and the projected funding from selling the credits. And it also, they look at the social value of those projects, and they use the UK Social Value Bank to do this. This allows them to measure measurements along the wealth and health, well-being and health and the environmental benefits to residents as well of those homes alongside the carbon emission benefits. Once the works are complete, the credits can be originated through the VCS scheme, and then they're sold to provide funding for further projects or for those housing associations to use against their own emissions. So far, they've got interest from the sector, from companies like finance institutions and building organisations who want to purchase these credits, and they are expecting that for each sort of an average full house retrofit, they might generate £5,000 to £7,000 of revenue for housing providers. And this, until the credits, they feel they're going to be able to resell those annually until 2042. So it's quite a long lasting scheme, but I'm not quite sure how that fits with permanence, that some of the other speakers have talked about before. Next slide. There's some other interesting developments with local authorities that might be pertinent to Cumbria. In London, several London boroughs all implemented a sort of carbon offset scheme for new developments, but under Section 106 agreements. So developers of new buildings not achieving net zero must pay a mandatory payment into a fund. Price of carbon for that ranges from £200 to £1,800 a tonne. The funds are ring fenced for emission reduction projects in existing building stock. So it's not it's got some verifications around it, but it's not a carbon credit as such. Cambridgeshire County Council are looking into developing a decarbonisation fund as well, to allow businesses to invest in local carbon reduction projects through methodologies agreed by businesses and scrutinised at national level. It's just in development, but they would look to include Section 106 agreements plus voluntary agreements from businesses based on reporting their Scope 1 and 2 emissions. They are planning for 3 different types of levels of projects, carbon reduction projects, sequestration, and also carbon avoidance projects. And that is sort of similar idea that's behind area-based insetting, which is an organisation called Anthesis, is working on with local authorities. It's a new approach to attract finance and to report carbon savings around carbon avoidance, reduction and removal projects. They're developing robust methodologies, not technologies, robust methodologies to measure the impact of the local carbon reduction projects and match them to funding. So the aim is that that would work with councils in their areas on their carbon reduction plans, and this will be a mechanism for funding. So those are other options. If you just want to have a positive climate impact in your local community, and verification isn't necessarily what your ethos is, you could do do something yourself, like organisation Chimney Sheep have done, which is the next slide. So local firm Chimney Sheep make draft proofing products from local wool, and they've set up a separate community interest company called Byland Plant Trees, and they put part of their profits into the organisation. They don't just do tree planting, it does heath redevelopment. They put nature first to create a more diverse habitat. And they recognise that that whilst their customers will find it a positive thing, it wasn't their main driver. They wanted to do something in their local community. And the tree planting sites and fields that they buy, the assets are locked from those because they've set it up through a community interest company model. So they must be retained to benefit the community, which I suppose offers some level of permanence.
You're at 10 minutes now, Caroline, if you could.
Okay, yeah, next slide. The last sort of options you can go for is obviously you can donate, volunteer, or develop a partnership with any number of climate organisations in the county. Or there's potential around renewable energy and looking at community energy projects locally. If you go to the next slide, there's lots of links to those kind of organisations.
I just want to say a massive thank you to Dimitri, John, Tim, Caroline, and to the Molly and Nigel who've been behind the scenes, making sure that all the tech has worked. A recording of the presentations will be made available on CAF's website, and we'll be putting that out and promoting it through our social media. So do please share that with colleagues or friends who might be interested. And just a little plug that I want to say, as a charity, CAFS receives very little core funding. If you have found this free webinar useful, please do consider supporting us so that we can do more of this kind of thing to really help Cumbria respond to the climate emergency that we face. And there's a link to donating in the chat that's just appeared there. Without further ado, thank you very much. Hope you've enjoyed it. See you again soon.